Hello, in this video we'll look at gRPC services in C#, the sort of alternative perhaps to REST, to your controllers and things. This isn't necessarily about theory, it's more about how you can actually implement in practice and how you can actually test the whole thing, because it is quite tricky to set up, especially if you're coming from controllers, perhaps minimal APIs these days background. You can watch a video on that as well. It can be a bit tricky, but essentially to get started, what you need this ASP.NET Core gRPC service project. There is a specific service. There is some default stuff going into it, but let's get started by looking at this proto file. It's called greet.proto. Now the name is basically just the sort of default file, and we kind of built a little example on top of that just so we can clearly see how we can expand it and how we can actually use it. So your proto file is essentially the definition of your whole backend, you could say, right? So in a similar way, you would have controllers, and then perhaps in controllers you inject the services, although in this case this is only a definition which you can take and then upload it to Postman, and then Postman can sort of better decipher your whole arrangement in your application, how the services are and what they need to take in and what they need to return. So this isn't exactly posting and getting that response with that request. It's a bit different, right? Essentially, the idea is that your client will just use your backend as methods. If we look at this simple user service, this is a service. It is injected in sort of a different kind of a way, not necessarily in your straightforward dependency injection way. But we have this user service and it is defined somewhere. Now it is defined in that proto file. So we have these definitions and then we actually implement a service. Let's look at the get user, a relatively simple thing. So it is just a method, right? Your client will actually use a method. It won't use some kind of HTTP request or anything like that. You don't have to construct the parameters. You don't have to construct all the body, JSON body or whatever it is. It would be JSON body actually, as you will see, but it's not exactly that. You just use it as a method. Although from the perspective of Postman, for example, or whatever other application you might use, it's kind of very simple to regular API routes. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. So we have that response, we have that request, and we have a server call context. I will probably discuss about that a bit later, but essentially this is just a method. The repository is just a memory repository where we don't actually do that much, and then we return a response. That's it. That's all we have to do. But remember, we have this proto file, and in the proto file we have the actual definition here. So we use user service, which we inherit from user service v1 because we want to version, and again this is a great way to actually version them so you don't have some weird problems, and it is sort of advised to do that, especially if you have some production application, something that's already been done and it's a sort of stable condition. It's a good way to do it. So the way we define it, we define first of all the general service that we have, user service in this case, and you might have product service, basically whatever services you use, you would define in this or another proto file for each service. But just to compare a bit, in this sort of example greeter message, we kind of define the whole thing, service and greeter like this, very simple. And then we have a request. So essentially the same thing as we do here, but here we now have more services. You can separate that in different protos, but again, you can use different services like we have here, greeter service and user service in one single file. The other thing is we need to define exactly what the user request is. So we don't just create some model. Well, not exactly, we kind of have this. If you look here, we have definitions for a user response, get request. Get request would be just a simple ID, right? So kind of like a parameter, but we don't use parameters. It all goes essentially in one body. We don't need to deal with whether it's a get, a post, or we use parameters, or maybe form body, or maybe JSON body, or something else. So it's just very clearly defined as essentially as a method. And this definition in Proto you will use as a model. So we have get user request, get user response. If we look, say here, we have get user request, get user response, and then we have get user. That is the method. If we go back to the UserService.cs, the actual file where we have your method, we have this get user right here. So we can do all kinds of things with that, and we can also provide an error response. Now, the response will be part of this get user response, so it needs to sort of be defined. If we can get to this, we can't get to this, unfortunately. That feature is still not available, but you can manually go through. In .NET 10, they have improved this thing quite a lot, and .NET 9 as well. It used to be very tricky to even get started with it, sort of set it up, but now it's a bit more decent. And as you can see, the result here is quite simple. We have error response, user response. Just a very basic definition of it. Now, to actually test it in Postman, what you need to use, you need to create a request type of gRPC. So if you're adding something new, let's do new, you see there's GraphQL, Socket.io, all kinds of things. What you need is gRPC. Once you have it, you'll have this URL. So this is just your local host or whatever domain you're testing. Again, same as any HTTP old-fashioned request. Well, it's not old-fashioned, really. There are use cases for this and use cases for that, but this is not about the theory. So what you do is you select a method. So you'll be either using get user in this case or create user, but you always want to upload that schema, the greet.proto file or whatever proto file it may be. So if we load that, now you see a whole list of methods you can use, and actually all the services that are defined within the file. So we have greeter service, that default example that Visual Studio provides. And then we also have this user service v1. So we can get user, list users, all kinds of things we can do. There is a bit of a downside here. We can use get user like this, and we can jump into this and copy it here. But essentially, if you want to create a message, you kind of have to do it yourself. But let's say, it's probably not going to be correct, but essentially this is just a simple JSON structure. So we provide the ID. It does give some suggestions, but sometimes it might be a bit tricky to actually insert. Other than that, you get your scripts before invoke, on message, after response, a bit different to those regular requests with get and post, but you still get the same kind of testing capability here, as well as authorization, but that's a matter for another video. Probably next week we'll try to put out something on authorization and sort of security matters of gRPC, which is a sort of a tricky arrangement as well. But if we now run this, we should be able to get something, although we will get an empty list at this point. So instead of doing that, let's go into this request and let's talk about this one. Then we can run both and see the results and how they kind of interact with each other. So now we have this whole thing running. We don't need the user ID here, but this one does require some input, but again, there is no post, there is no method, HTTP method here. it doesn't matter if we just retrieve data or we insert data, there's no difference. Again, we just use the message has some data, and we can invoke. And if we invoke, we get something created. The ID in the result is 4, but I believe we don't actually require ID in this case. There is some validation possible as well, but that's a matter for the other videos. But you also get the version. So versioning is very important in these arrangements. It's a bit more trickier than regular HTTP requests. But you also get your other data, and if we create another user, that should be perfectly fine. But essentially, this is just a memory database, so it doesn't really give any interesting results. Now, if we go here, we can actually delete this. There is a request, perhaps not. It should have been a request, but I believe if it's 4, it should get something. Okay, it's not found. But in any case, we would get a result based on that. What we can do is actually try and list the users. That is, that is the result. We have some just predefined users actually for this, so we don't need to mess with the database. But as you can see, we list the users. We don't need a message, but it does, if it does get sent, it kind of gets ignored. And then we get this beautiful list, which we can actually take a look at now here, and then we'll just look at the setup in Program.cs as well. So let's see, this last one, we have the error message, we have user response, but we have this list. Now, listing is kind of an interesting thing. Again, it's the same kind of a response. You saw it was a bit different in Postman, but essentially the way you would actually set it up, it's exactly the same thing, more or less. You just add your pagination and do all those things. Let's jump into that just for a second. Let's see where it is. Again, the features in terms of navigation in Visual Studio aren't exactly perfect yet, but they are there to some extent at least. So essentially, what we have here, we have list request, right? And then the response is it's a bit different. So instead of just having a list of some kind, we need to essentially transfer it as data stream, which again makes it quite a bit different from your regular HTTP calls. Now, the reason for that is because it would load, if we didn't have it, if it was just a list or some kind of an object containing a massive list, the way streaming works, and it is streaming in general with gRPC, it loads all the stuff that you have in memory. So without streaming, it will first load everything in memory. There will be a huge memory spike, and that means there will be a sort of long wait time before the client gets first result, and then the client can't process the data right away. And in general, the point of this gRPC is that we do things right away, we do things instantly. So if you have maybe 5 users in a list, you don't probably need this. It's all going to be great and good. But if you have 1,000 users or 10,000 users, you should definitely consider the stream writer. I serve a stream writer that creates a stream, and then essentially, as the word would suggest, it streams all the responses one by one, and you can your client rather can fetch a result right away and then go to the next, and it doesn't have to basically overload that memory, which is a risk as well. So it might not get delivered at all, but there might just be a huge waiting time as well. So that's the memory concerns, that's the lists and streams. Now let's take a look at the last part, which is probably one of the more important parts, the setup in Program.cs. Now, you don't need to do a lot of it. If you're starting from non-gRPC project, that's going to be a lot trickier. The way to do that, to kind of adjust your existing projects, Better not to do it at all. Better to just have an additional project for gRPC. It works a bit better, but just find a clean copy of one and try to compare. But essentially, there are a few things. We use AddGrpc. We add with options. Now, we don't necessarily have to add options as such, and max receive message size and max send message size, that will vary on your needs. This is a sort of almost a default value, really reasonable value, 4 megabyte size. Of course, depending on your needs, you might change that, but usually it would be probably low. It would be under 1 megabyte at most, because you don't need that. That's not really the point of the whole thing here. It's just sort of quick transaction. If you do need to transfer large files and things like that, then probably gRPC is not the best option for you. You probably should have some kind of HTTP call or REST API arrangement, perhaps connected to the gRPC project, perhaps a separate entity going sort of alongside your project, but do consider the needs and what you're actually going to use it for. Now, the next thing is just use a repository. We inject the repository that we will use in the service. The interesting thing is how we inject and then use the services. So we do need both a greeter service and user service. We do need to inject them both as your normal dependency injected service, whether it's Blazor or APIs or whatever it is. But here the difference is we need to map gRPC to each service. So if you have a service defined in the proto file, you need to define it in your Program.cs and map the service like this, map gRPC service and that type of service. Everything else, the checkpoint is for health. In general, the suggestion is always to have one of these. It can be quite useful. And then the sort of maybe trickier part, the welcome endpoint, which we absolutely do not need. There's no need for this. There's no need for that. However, health checkpoint, probably a good idea just to have it. It doesn't hurt performance to have one. It doesn't do anything really. But just to kind of see if your gRPC service breaks for some reason after some update, then you can at least check if the app is running and, you know, is gRPC maybe some definition mapping problem, maybe something else, but it's very, very good to have this. Of course, having logs helps, but sometimes with gRPC errors can be quite tricky to find. And with that said, we will conclude this video.